Why would I do that? Do you have it, Emma? Okay. I'll just wait for you to do it then. Oh, crap. There we go. All right. Welcome back, everyone. Appreciate you coming tonight. So I'm gonna do a talk on CNNs. It's very intro, so like I'm gonna assume no knowledge and kind of orient like a new person, like a person new to machine learning, within like this topic of computer vision. Before we get to that though, we got some new eBoard members. So if you guys want to introduce yourselves, let's start with Josh, whoever.
Take the honor first. I'm Josh. Nice to meet everyone. I am events coordinator. I'm a junior in computer science and math. And in terms of research, I work in human computer interaction. And then we also know me from TA2, CS2 systems.
Hi, I'm Michael. I'm a senior studying CS and math, so that's there's a lot of diversity in the board. I'm gonna be the director of marketing, so we can share things.
I'm on the director of outreach. I'm a junior studying bio and math, and I basically take I take care of basically recruiting new members, trying to work, so it's okay. I'm Paula, a sophomore. I actually transferred to DC, so I'm a major in business side, so I guess I am better student. I'm doing the software and engineering, the role we kind of like made up, kind of still like hashing it out, just how to balance between like regular keyboard stuff and then like just you guys to actually press this.
All right. And then you had an announcement, right?
Software too, but there is a new lab at Dana-Farber that's working on the computational pediatric work. They're actively like looking for people to either like join as like a full-time member if you're like looking for like post-graduation plans, or just like looking for an internship or something like that. I don't know if they can pay you. They can give you lots of experience. But yeah, I'll send the link to the guy's website. Like you can kind of read what he does, and then I think you can like, email him or something if you're interested in it. So just keep your eye out. And also, if you have questions, just like.
Very cool. Yeah, so as I was saying before, this is a very like introductory lecture. If you have any questions at all, just like interrupt me and ask. Like the whole point of this is just to learn. And if you're more experienced and you're like, I already know everything, I'm sorry about that. But yeah, I'll just get into it. So we're gonna be talking about convolutional neural networks. And to start with, I'm just gonna motivate like why I care about this topic, why is it something people care about. So just from a very high level, it's used in a lot of different applications. So like facial recognition, like there's a lot of systems out there that can utilize a CNN to try to recognize a person's face. It can be used within like the medical imaging domain. So like basically Professor Don Lai does a lot of work with this. And if you're interested in like looking at ribs or brains or things like that, you could potentially apply a CNN to this problem. You can also use it for like object detection or like looking at some sort of image and saying like, oh yeah, there's a person over there. That's like a stoplight, things like that. You can imagine this like might have applications in like driving car. And maybe unexpectedly for even experienced people, it can be used in military applications, which I'll actually touch on a little bit later. So maybe you could use this in figuring out where your F-16 is if you just like happen to own an F-16. But more on that later. And so just like to kind of orient people like within like the CNN timeline, like how did this all get started? I wanted to just like talk about some papers briefly, not go into too much detail on them like right now, but just like, oh yeah, here are some like key papers, some names that you should know. So like when you start talking to other people who do work in machine learning, you might pick up on like some of these names and be like, oh, I kind of know what that is. And you can get to know more about it. So you can almost think of this as like a brief history of time, but it's more like a brief history of CNNs and not Stephen Hawking, but Stephen Roach. But stupid jokes aside, so the first paper I want to talk about is from 1980. So it's called Neocognitron. And the idea was this was all like based off the visual system within the human body. So they came up with this architecture, which they basically have like an input, and they had these two different cells, which are feature extraction and pooling, which I'll talk about more later. The idea is you can kind of like sample down your input and eventually be able to understand this like what the input is. So you can classify it into maybe one of 10 different categories. So this was the first paper that came up with a lot of the ideas used in the CNN. And then the next one I want to talk about is AlexNet. So this came out in 2012 and it was made by these authors. And the reason why this one was more important, or maybe not more important, but also significant, it was the first winner of the ImageNet Challenge. It was this basically the ImageNet Challenge is a data set that has a lot of different categories with many different examples for each category. So it won that when it first started out, but from 2012 on, this architecture that was similar to AlexNet, the CNN, it won every single year after 2012. So this is like a very powerful framework for understanding, like if you give me an image of an airplane or a soccer ball, it can tell you like it is an airplane or a soccer ball. So this is the architecture that was used in the paper. I just like copied and pasted it from the paper. It has 8 layers. And I'll talk more about like pooling and stride and all these things later. But essentially it has these input, it has the convolutional layers, some pooling, and also normalization. And then by the end, it gives you an output and it's able to give the prediction. Yeah, so going back to that ImageNet, I want to just briefly introduce some data sets because I've been talking about some models, but you might not be totally familiar with the data sets. So just going off that, ImageNet, it has more than 14 million images and more than 20,000 categories. So this just gives like an example. It's a subset of the data set. There's a lot of different things from like fruits or animals, like that's like a starfish. And it's pretty popular to test how good your model is at classification for images. And then, yeah, another important thing I want to know, it was actually created by Dr. Fei-Fei Li, who is professor at Stanford University, very famous. And some people in the club actually got to meet her a couple weeks ago, which is cool. And then another popular data set that you should be aware of is MNIST. So it's just a bunch of different numbers that are supposed to be like handwritten. And so again, this is just another data set you can apply your model to. Say you get one of these zeros and you can say like, I think this is a 0 or 1 or whatever, and you can test how accurate your model is. And just to give credit, this was made by Yann LeCun and Karina Cortez. Yeah, just another very popular one. You'll probably see it in like your machine learning class, things like that. And then this is the last one I want to talk about. It's called CIFAR 10. So the 10 comes from the categories. So you have like frogs, dogs, deer. Again, just another data set that you can use to test how good your model is. There's also like variations. So there's 100 versions. So CIFAR 100 with 100 different categories. So just another popular data set you can draw from if you want to like try a model, see how good it does, and apply it to a data set. And then lastly, I want to talk about ResNet. So the thing about this, and maybe this is a little bit more advanced if you're just getting into convolutional neural networks, but they introduced a different architecture called the residual network or block. So in the original CNN networks, you kind of had this architecture where you have an input, it's going through this convolutional layer, which I'll talk about in a second. You apply an activation function, maybe another convolutional layer, and you get your output. It's very similar, but it has this different connection here. So it's sort of skipping is what they call. As you can tell, it skips these layers and it passes the input maybe later on to the end. And it had some pretty good success. It won some competitions. So this is another like landmark model from 2015 that's just pretty relevant. People talk about a lot. So that's the history. And now I'm going to talk about the like nuts and bolts of how it works so you can kind of have a good understanding of that. So going back to like maybe if you took the MNIST architecture and you're like, how could I make a model to like predict something reasonably well? This is how the convolutional approach would work. So you get some input, say like a handwritten 2, and you apply the conv layer, then pooling and fully connected layers maybe at the end, maybe something like softmax if you're trying to do classification. And then hopefully you get the correct output. So this is just like the overall picture of what the components are, and I'm going to go into each component. But you can imagine like now that you've set up these connections and you get some output, you can run back propagation, update the weights in maybe your conv layer or your fully connected layer. And from there, you could just keep, training, improving the weights and get better outputs over time. Does that make sense? Okay. Does anyone have questions at this point? No. Okay. So I'm going to start going into the convolutional layer. So maybe just for people who are really new, if you are given an image, the idea is behind each like image, you can break up into a grid. And for something like this, which is black and white, you can assign pixel values. So maybe if it's white, you give it a value of 1, or if it's black, you give it a value of 0. And if it's some sort of gray, you give it an intermediate value. And the reason why you want to do this is once you create this pixel like mapping, you can now apply something called a filter. So this is an example of what a filter might look like. In this case, it's 3 by 3, but that's variable. You can change that. It could be 5 by 5 or 7 by 7. Typically, it's an odd number, which I can talk about in a second. But the idea is you have this grid with the numbers in it being your weights. And this is the like original image, but the pixel value is represented by some numbers. And so you're going to put your filter on your image. So maybe you put it like there and you do multiplication and addition. So you would do like 1 times 1, 1 times 0, 1 times 1, and so on. And then you can output a value. And the idea is you keep doing this over time and you get a new almost feature. We call it a feature map, but you can still kind of think of it as like an image for now. Yeah. So you might notice though that this is getting smaller, and that has a lot to do with the size of the kernel. So if you chose, say, a 3 by 3 kernel, but you add another column and a row like that, you can actually maintain the same feature size output. But that just depends on how you want to set it up. And then going into like specific types of filters. So when you're using a normal, say you like go into PyTorch and you get a CNN, normally what you do is use backpropagation to update the values. But to give like a more intuitive sense for what that is doing, I'm going to talk about more traditional filters that were used before like deep learning became super popular. So this one's called the Prewitt operator. So the idea is you can try to, if I give you like an image of a cat, you can try to figure out like edges in it, because maybe you want to do edge detection, which could help you identify some object. So this kernel would help you identify horizontal edges, and that would be vertical edges. And just to give like a real example of what that looks like, again, if I give you a cat and you apply that filter in this fashion, you'd get like this new version, which is basically just showing you edges and lines within it. So that's just an example of how a filter can be used in practice. And then also like another example is a median filter. So maybe your sensors for capturing data is not very good. You can end up with like salt and pepper images, things with a lot of noise. So what the median does is that like each square, you're taking the average of all those pixel values and you output it. So it can be used for cleaning up images like that. Yeah. So now going back to that example, I was talking about when you apply this filter, sometimes you're shrinking, or like you can shrink your size of the image, which may or may not be desirable. So you can figure out like what's going to happen to that image through this formula. So the idea is like you have the width of the image, and then you have the size of your filter, and then you may have padding, you may not. And then the S is for striding. So just to like explain with our padding and stride. So like if I just have an image like this, and I just divide it up, and then my filter is like 3 by 3, so it's in this region. The stride is how far you move the kernel. So at the first step, you do that like multiplication and addition, like I was talking about. But then after that, you're gonna move the kernel to another spot in the image. So if you had a stride of 1 on the next step, instead of it being these squares, you would move it over here. And you just keep doing that throughout. So you go all the way down, and then eventually you go into this and so on. But if you had a stride of 2, you would skip 2 rows at a time. So if it was like, again, back in this region right here, you would move it 2 over and do that. So that's what stride is, just how much you're moving it. And then padding is basically you're adding like, usually you can do something like 0 padding. So if I had a 3x3 filter like this, you could add padding around it and fill these with zeros. That. And the advantage of that is if you do the math out, you actually will maintain the same feature map. Which maybe I didn't put in, but if you do that out, you have, say, a padding of 1 on each side. So now you're adding 2 in. So that would be 5 minus 3 plus 2, which is 4. And then you're adding 1 at the end. So you get 5. So you could actually maintain the same size. But so you might be asking, like, why would we potentially want to make it smaller? Because you're like almost maybe losing information or something like that. The reason is, as you do this, and this is why there's pooling layers, it actually can help you train faster because you don't need as many parameters. So a very popular way to use pooling is called max pooling. So if you do this like convolutional operation and you get some output like this, you could maybe break it up into windows as shown on the projector, and then you take the max. So the idea behind that is like you're taking max pool, if you have a really big input, you're essentially keeping some of the more perhaps like relevant like numbers within each part of the image. So as you do that, you don't have to have as many parameters, and it can make it like more reasonable, more time efficient to train. So that's why people use things like pooling. It can help you just train faster. And then lastly, again, in this architecture, once you get to the very end of this, you want to probably do some classification. So a good way of doing that is through this thing called softmax. So imagine at the end of this whole network, you got these like outputs. Then using this equation, you can get these probabilities. Now, there's some reasons behind like why this equation is written like this. So if you think about like you have a bunch of different categories, you want to put different probabilities on each category. So you can say like, oh yeah, it's like 90% a cat and 10% a dog. The thing with probabilities is they all have to sum up to 1, and they ought to be positive. So if you apply the E and then you raise it to whatever this value is, that'll ensure it's positive because E to the X is a positive function. And then if you sum over all possibilities, you are now like normalizing it. So, if you added up all of the possibilities, then you would get 1. So that's why it's pretty much written like this. You want to make sure everything's positive and everything will sum to 1 at the end. So it's like a probability. Any questions? Okay. So now I want to talk about some cool applications. The first one is something I did last summer. And then the second thing I'm going to show is from a recent paper that from 2023, which I thought was cool. So last summer I was working at NOAA. It's like the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration. And the project I was assigned was similar to what I was talking about with the F-16. The idea is like you have some sort of airplane, you're flying around, but you don't know where it is. But what you do get is magnetic readings. So maybe you're in an airplane and you're like in this region, but you don't really know where in that region you are. And we're gonna assume like you don't know, like you can't see out your window, so you can't like see the ground, you can't see the stars, and you don't have GPS. So like there's really no way to know where you are. But you can measure the total magnetic field. And then with that, we give you like a map. So maybe you can know like, oh yeah, this is what the magnetic field looks like in my area. And from there, we're going to take measurements as you fly. So you might fly along. And what I did was I took 68 measurements. I didn't actually, like, of course, fly a plane, but I made up like flight paths. So the idea is like the plane was taking measurements. And from there, I tried different models out. And I guess just to give a little bit more context, the reason why like we are assuming like you can't see out your windows, you can't see the stars or things like that is because like there's real world situations where like those things may be true. Like if it's daytime, you can't see the stars. you could try terrain mapping, like looking at the ground and saying like, oh, yeah, this looks like this place on in the world, so I know I'm here. But if you're over an ocean, that's not going to work because the ocean looks pretty much the same everywhere. And then not having GPS is actually pretty realistic. If we ever end up in a big war, that's probably the first thing that will like go away. So this is why like they're looking into this stuff. Um, yeah. So, but what the thing is with magnetic readings is basically they works for all those conditions, so like day or night, over the ocean or not. And it's hard to jam. So the sword, if you have like a magnetic source, it decays really rapidly. So it'd be hard for someone to jam your readings, which is, of course, the government would like that. So yeah, so this was my problem. And I tried a few different architectures. I tried a multi-layer perceptron, an LSTM, and then a convolutional neural network, which actually was the best one. So this was the architecture I was trying. So the idea is like you have these readings you're getting, and then I was applying a convolutional layer, some batch norm, that pooling, and then at the end, like some flattening so I could use the linear layer. The idea is I want to get the longitude and latitude. But different from like what I was showing here, because my input was like a time series of just different values, like 70 or 10, 0, maybe -10. I was using a 1D version of this. So my filter, say it was 3 numbers, I would have like a weight here, and I would apply it to each section of it. So if I apply to here, I would do that pairwise multiplication, addition, so on, and then use back propagation to update the weights. So you can use 1D CNNs, which are actually really popular for time series problems. So you might see people in finance using them. But yeah, just wanted to, that's basically how I found out about it. I was like looking up time series approaches that people have used, and I didn't realize, but I guess 1D CNNs are pretty popular and successful, which is cool. And then just some results, just to show like the CNN really has some good power. So when I was showing you that region here, people like had to go sample these readings. So like in this case, they were flying airplanes around over the ocean, they drive boats, and they do that at a certain spacing. They usually do that 4 kilometers. And the reason for that is it's close enough where like, well, it's far enough apart where it's like somewhat reasonable to actually like get the sampling. But also like you might be wondering, what do you do about the intermediate values? You can look into like some physics, and continuity applies between like the magnetic field at each point. So you can basically estimate in between, which is nice. So basically, given that 4 kilometer sampling, which is like 4 kilometers in a latitude or longitude direction, I got like pretty close to the resolution, which is good. And then this is just showing like the true position of my airplane and what the CNN predicted, which overall is pretty close. And then that was like my loss function, trying to optimize the absolute error. Is there any questions about that before I go into the last example? Okay, cool. And then this is the last thing I want to talk about, which I thought was interesting. So I found someone had used the CNN to try to recognize human activity. So the idea is like on your smartwatch or things like that, it's tracking all this data about like your heart rate or things you're doing. And maybe from that data, we can try to classify like, what the person is doing. So there's a cool data set out there, which essentially has these signals. So if you're like walking or jogging or standing, whatever, they were able to actually forget what they were measuring, but they could measure, they had some sensor data, and they had it like this. And interestingly enough, like I thought they might apply a 1D CNN or something like that, because it's basically a time series, but they actually applied a 2D convolutional neural network, and they got the best results on this data set of 97% accuracy, which was pretty interesting, and I was not expecting that. And yeah, I guess to go into like how they were doing it. So I didn't mention this before, but when I was explaining how like a CNN operates, I was talking about black and white images where it's just like a single value for each pixel. But in real images, you're gonna have red, green, and blue, which are you can split up into these 3 channels. And then from there, you can apply CNN to each channel and repeat the process, and at the end you get an output. So that's what they were doing with the 2D convolutional neural network. And yeah, I guess I should have mentioned that, but that's how they were doing it. And then some of the results they got is right here with the confusion matrix. So for like downstairs, it was pretty accurate, but they had like a couple misses. But for these examples, like sitting, standing, or being upstairs, it was perfectly accurate, which was pretty cool. And yeah, they did a bunch of different metrics. So they did like accuracy, they did precision, recall, and the F1 score, which are right here. So you can just look at it. So it seemed like it was less good with walking, but pretty accurate, as I was saying, with like being downstairs or upstairs, things like that. And just in case you haven't seen these terms before, this is what I was meaning by accuracy, precision, recall. So what these stand for is like true positives, false negatives, things like that. And what that terminology comes from is like, if I give you an example and your model makes a prediction, you can classify as being correct or incorrect or things like that. And you usually do it in this box where you have like maybe true, or true, and like the prediction, and the actual like label. So maybe your prediction is they're walking and that was correct, then it would be a true positive. And if you were, so it's true positive and false positive. So maybe another way to explain this more simply is like if you have a COVID test, like if you have COVID and the test says you have COVID, that's a true positive. If you have COVID, but the test says like you don't have COVID, it's a false positive. Or sorry, the other way. I'm getting confused. But yeah. If you don't have COVID and it says no, it's a false negative. If you don't have COVID and you said if you don't have COVID and it says you don't have it, that's a true negative because it's right about you not having it. If it says you have it while you don't have it, then that's a false negative. Yeah, and so on. Sorry for explaining that for you, but that's basically what those terms are. Do you have questions about that? Like how they were getting these metrics or okay. Yeah, so that's what I just wanted to talk about. That's actually the end of my presentation because I guess I should have prepared more content, but yeah. Yeah.
Like and distance terms, how big of a error is like 0.04?
Yeah, I put that on the slide. It's about 4.6 kilometers over on average. Yeah, that number came from the mean absolute error. Yeah.
When you, when you're showing your CNN for that task, what was the purpose of the batch form?
So the batch normalization can help with like outliers. So the idea is you have a batch of 100 things. You take the mean and the variance. So you can subtract out from each value the mean of all of them and also divide by the variance. So overall you can like, kind of rescale the values from the input. So okay, it's like you have a bunch of inputs. So I'll just make it simple. So if you have like 10, 20, and 30, and these are inputs, maybe before passing this into your layer, like maybe this is some convolutional layer, you want to rescale these values so they're easier to work with. So you can find the mean and the variance of those three. And then for each one, you subtract out like the mean, you divide by the variance. And then you pass this new value in instead of say 10. Yeah, it's okay.
So when you label the data, is it just like time series for a certain like zone, and then you classify to like which zone is in? Like, no.
Yeah, so actually, it was the project I was working on, we weren't sure if it was gonna work. So what I did for that is I had like a region, like I showed, say for Europe.
Yeah.
And then underneath, like it has that sampling, so you know, you have these values that people have like gone through and measured the magnetic value. So to actually come up with those flight paths, what I did is I made it simple and I just said like, all right, choose wherever they sampled. So that's just like a big circle. And then I just made straight paths. And the reason why like this is obviously very simplistic, but I made straight paths of I think it was 70 kilometers or so. So just sampling evenly. And then I used those as my input. So I was using like the positional data to sample from the map, but when I passed into the model, all I kept was the magnetic reading. Yeah. So that's a very like simple version of the problem, which we weren't sure was even solvable with like machine learning. You can make it more complex by allowing like more varied paths instead of just really straight. Also behind the scenes, like we're keeping the same altitude. Because if you change your altitude, that affects the magnetic readings. As you go up, everything looks smoother. But the closer you are to different magnetic sources, you have more like uniqueness, so it's easier to identify where you are. So just even when that simple case, it was still like we don't know if it's gonna work. But yeah, that's how I got the actual. Yeah.
Were you implementing like a pre-written CNN or did you write it from like scratch?
I guess like I wrote it from scratch, but I used PyTorch. So, like I wasn't like coding up all of the inner workings, like the propagation and everything. I was more just taking that library and coding up the layers from there.
And like, where did you find like resources?
I think when I started, I just started learning stuff on YouTube. Just like, you know, people have like tutorial series of like 30 videos or something. So I like follow that. But now that like I kind of know how to use PyTorch and like the basic skills, I just like read articles, like see what other people are doing. When I was like testing out the three different, because I was testing out multi-layer perceptron, LCM, and this. Within all those, I was trying out like, okay, what if I change the number of layers? What if I change like the optimizer, things like that. So that just like looking through the documentation, it's like, okay, like PyTorch has these optimizers, these ones have these effects. Like, let's just see how this one affects it. It's a lot of experimentation too. But, yeah. Yeah. So
What's something advantage of
for just in general or for this, like
for this and also for the last example, we mentioned that they use the 2D paper.
yeah, the reason why I didn't expect that for the last one, is because I usually when I've seen time series, people apply CNN, they do one dimensional because it's like you have your different values at points of time. That's one dimensional, and they just apply this linear for 1D currently to try to get the right values. But they were plotting it on an axis, so it was like basically on a graph, and it looked like that. So they were applying 2D to the actual like, image of it. And then you're also asking about why using it for the navigation stuff. Yeah, so I guess the advantage would perhaps be like because as you're flying along, like the magnetic values are gonna be related to the ones before and that come after it. Like if you're flying over a mountain, the one before like your magnetic reading will be very high. So like, you can imagine like you're flying over the mountain, you might be doing that for like 20 time steps. So all those time steps are somewhat related. So this like kernel, when you apply it to your time series, relates the values because you're doing some sort of multiplication with values that are next to each other. So that's why I think it did reasonably well because it was able to say, yeah, if you look at the say last 5 values, it could basically infer where it was.
How long would the time series be usually? Is it over 100 miles or more or less?
I was doing 70 kilometers. Now just keeping that constant. Just again to make it simple, because we weren't sure if it was gonna work. Yeah.
At what altitude were the actual measurements taken for the magnetic fields?
4 kilometers.
And then was the sample flight path, was that also at 4 kilometers or did you?
Yeah, because there's like a thing, so if we chose a different altitude, you have to do what's called like upward continuation. So you can take like the magnetic readings and continue it upward, however high you
Then it gets like more diluted, probably, right, or? is that-
Yeah, yeah, so like, if this is like the graph of readings, maybe at like 4 kilometers, it might look, wait. If, maybe this is like nanotesla, so like the readings, and you're at 4 kilometers, it might be like very spiky, so you can kind of determine where you are. But as you increase the altitude, everything blurs together. And so it might look more like that or something. As you keep going up, it will look smoother and smoother. So can't really tell you apart. Yeah.
Why'd you choose the loss function?
So actually, I first tried mean squared error because I thought the square would be more important. But my mentor suggested I do absolute error because they thought there would be outliers. And so the absolute error can help be a little bit more robust to that.
As you go higher, you're saying it gets smoother. So that means it only works at low altitudes.
Yeah.
I think side of things, do you think they would use this for like missiles or something?
Probably.
Or F-16.
Oh, that was it. So, yeah, thanks for coming.
Anyway, but I'm saying that, Chris.